That's a pretty good tragic backstory. Why mess with it? It's good. The Watch will always be good and will succeed and... Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Lizzie and I've recently watched The Watch, which is a line that sounds like it was lifted straight from the script of The Watch, to be honest. I'm not going to do an in-depth review of this because I would be here all day. We would be here for hours and hours and hours. But as a quick overview of my thoughts on this TV show, it was fine overall. The Watch is an adaptation, and I use that word incredibly loosely, of some of the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett. On the title card for the show, it says, inspired by characters created by Terry Pratchett, which I think is the best description of it. It is as loose an adaptation as you can possibly be. I went in with very low expectations. Does it hold up as an adaptation of Discworld? No. Was it enjoyable to watch? It was fine. It had some good moments. It had some not so good moments. It was fine. But it was a terrible adaptation. There's no denying that it's a terrible adaptation. It reminded me a little bit of things like Clueless or Bride and Prejudice, things like that. Not to do a huge disservice to those by comparing it to this. If it had come out in 100 years' time and we had a big backlog of Terry Pratchett adaptations, this would be a fun, refreshing angle. But it's not. It's the only one we've got, and it's bad. It's bad. But, the show is it's fine just to watch. But today, I want to talk about the characterizations of some of the characters in the TV show, because I think that some of the details behind how they've been characterised is indicative of the whole show and where the whole show just kind of didn't quite make it there. I think you could have done a lot of the things that they did do. I liked the setting, I liked the way they approached the world building. I thought some of that was pretty good as to how they introduced the guilds, things like that. Some of that was good, and I think it would have worked better if they'd had a slightly different approach. And I think by looking at the characters, we can see exactly what that approach was. So we're going to go through all the characters, the kind of main characters one at a time, and see how they hold up. First of all, let's talk about Carrot. So in this version, he's just arrived in Ankh-Morpork, so kind of similar to his storyline at the start of Guards. And in many ways, they've kept similar things about Carrot. They've kept that he is a 6-foot dwarf, that he comes from a dwarfish family. They've kept his sort of naivety and his very, very strong sense of right and wrong that often gets him into trouble at the start. They've kept the fact that he is a descendant of Ankh-Morpork royalty. And that's about it. In many ways, I think Carrot is, on the surface, one of the closer characterizations. And I just do want to clarify that when I'm talking about the characterizations, I mean how they're written in the script and presented from a behind-the-scenes perspective. I think the cast were all really good for the script they were given, which is not the same as being good for the characters as they appear in the book. But I do think the cast did a good job with what they were working with. So all of the surface level stuff about Carrot has been kept the same. His sort of backstory, the key kind of flashcards of his characteristics are there. But what they've missed are a couple of crucial things that make Carrot the character he is. There are two things I'd like to talk about, and the first is his charisma, or lack thereof. So it's kind of a running joke, but also a source of confusion for the other officers in the books, that not only does Carrot have a very idealistic version of the world, but the world goes along with it. That he can get people to stop fighting, he can break up bar fights and get criminals to be very sorry and promise not to do it again, just on his sheer exuding goodness and charisma. And there was none of that. In fact, we saw him being beaten up by people in bars and things. His idealism is jaded as the show goes on, which Carrot is never jaded. At least I wouldn't say that he's ever is jaded. He becomes more aware of the world, and he has a better understanding of the world around him, but that never compromises his worldview, and he's an effective police officer because of that. The other thing is that in the books, part of the running gag of Carrot being the only surviving heir to the throne is that he doesn't want to be, and everyone knows he doesn't want to be, so they don't dare bring it up in case it upsets him. And in this one, he was sad to find out that maybe he wasn't, which just completely flew in the face of who Carrot is as a character. He is happy as a policeman. That's his job, that's his calling, and he's good at it. He doesn't want to be king, and that's the frustrating part from the other characters' perspectives, is that he would be such a good king, but the reason he would be a good king is he doesn't want to be king. So to see him be kind of bummed out that it turns out he wasn't the king, that kind of undermined a lot of his character. It's just so frustrating. Not only do those little things undermine who he is as a character, they're also the most interesting thing about him. They're what makes him different. They're what makes us sit up and pay attention to him. That he's not just a fresh-faced boy from the mountains with idealistic views. He also manages to impose those idealistic views on other people with success and makes the world a better place for it. And to see all that gone was so frustrating. Next, I'd like to talk about Angua. So I think that Angua is possibly the closest to how she was in the books. Of all of the main characters, she kind of rang the most true from what we see in the books. That being said, although her characterisation and her personality felt pretty much as in the books, kind of a watered down version, I would say, but all of her kind of main personality traits were there, I would say. Her backstory is replaced, and the whole way that werewolves work is completely different. First of all, let's talk about werewolves. So it didn't occur to me until I was watching the show that the way werewolves work in Discworld is very unusual compared to how werewolves work in every other piece of fiction. I first read Men at Arms when I was about 11 or 12, and Feet of Clay around the same time as well. So my perception of werewolves in fiction has been very much influenced by Angua. And it struck me in the very first episode when we find out that she's a werewolf, and we find out that once a month she locks herself up and becomes a monster. Which just isn't what happens. In the books, then, being a werewolf is something that to an extent you can control. You can turn into a wolf whenever you want to when it's not the full moon, and when it is the full moon, then you have to turn into a wolf. But even as a wolf, then you retain the same mind. You're the same person with the same control. And it's only if you stay as a wolf for a dangerous amount of time that you actually start thinking like a wolf. Which is so much more interesting. That's so much more interesting as an approach. And we know from the books that Angua's biggest fear is to lose control, is to become that werewolf and lose control. We see it in The Fifth Elephant. The whole book ends with her making Carrot promise to kill her if she ever loses control as a werewolf. Please ignore the police car outside. That is such a fundamental part of who she is, and her motivation behind everything she does is that she wants to be a good person. She doesn't want to be a monster like her brother is. Which brings us on to her backstory. So there was a scene where they have like flashbacks to their tragic backstories, and anyone who's experienced trauma before relives that trauma. So Cheery was reliving having to present as male, and Angua was reliving as a child, realising that she was dangerous and couldn't be trusted to be around humans, which is not how werewolves work on Discworld. But she is ostracised by humans on Discworld, so, you know, I could let that slide. But we see her be in a loving and supportive family of other werewolves who stick together and are a pack, and she's part of that pack. And her backstory is so interesting. The Fifth Elephant is one of my favourite books, and Angua's storyline is a huge part of that because it's so good. Even if you didn't want to get into the whole Yenorks thing about how werewolves work and things like that, which you could have done because you had a load of other unnecessary stuff, but you could have done that even if you didn't want to, then having a murderous brother who chased people out of town and killed people, and parents who were like werewolf eugenicists or something, that's a pretty good tragic backstory. Why mess with it? It's good. And here's why. This is my theory as to why they mess with it. Both her werewolfness and her backstory. And this also links into what I was talking about with Carrot and what I will talk about with all the other characters, which is tropes. I was running through a list of every other fictional werewolf I could think of, and even looking at more online to see if it supported this theory. Every other fictional werewolf I can think of loses control at the full moon. They become a monstrous wolf. Think of, even if you want to go for like recent examples, Ruby from Once Upon a Time, or Oz from Buffy, people like that, or Lupin from Harry Potter. All of those people, they become this monster at full moon that they can't control, and it's their biggest shame. We've seen it time and time again. So why not do something new and interesting? And it's the same with Carrot. He fulfills all of these tropes and then just kind of subverts them just that tiny bit. But instead we get the watered down, tropey version of Carrot. And the same with Angua's backstory. It's the same backstory we've seen before on other shows. It's the same. And they swapped out the more interesting version for the easier version. Apologies if the framing changed, the camera cut out, but we are back now. Okay, let's talk about Sybil. Sybil. Lady Sybil Vimes, née Ramkin, has a very special place in my heart. A very dear place in my heart. I do want to mention Lara Rossi was fantastic. Not at playing Terry Pratchett's Sybil Vimes, but at playing the character she had on the script. She did a really good job. She and Joe Eaton Kent, who played Cheery, were my two favourite actors on the show. I thought they really carried the show, and they were such strong screen presences. So shout out to Lara Rossi. My problem is not with you. The casting of Sybil was when I first had my suspicions about this show, because Sybil is kind and gentle and good and big, and those things mean that people don't take her seriously, even though she deserves to be, and she sometimes uses that in her favour. To see they'd cast a slim woman as Sybil was instantly like, okay, you haven't understood this character, because the way she moves in the world is massively influenced by how other people see her. So her physical appearance needs to have some influence there, i.e. she cannot be slim. She's not a slim character. There is one plus-size woman in all of fantasy. Why would you take her away? And then to see that she was basically some revenge-seeking vigilante who hated the guilds and everything they stood for. She just has nothing to do with Sybil. She has nothing to do with Sybil in the books. The only things they have in common is that they're called Sybil, they are aristocrats, and they have dragons. And they're in a relationship with Vimes-ish. That is where the similarities end. This is the starkest example of taking the bare bones, and I mean the absolute bare bones of a character, and putting them into the tropiest version you can. Because Sybil on screen is a strong female character, TM. She can shoot people and kick people and punch people and be angry and get things done. There was one little nod to the scene in Fifth Elephant where Sybil sings to kind of diffuse the situation, which I liked. But yes, she was sharp and intelligent and witty, but also violent and not Sybil. She just wasn't Sybil at all. Literally, I listed those 3 similarities, and one of them was that they're both called Sybil. And the other one is they're both called Lady Sybil. It's so frustrating because, again, the most interesting parts of her character have been taken away in exchange for creating something that fits a character we've seen before. Next up, sorry, I'm still exhausted after talking about Sybil. Okay, Vimes. So Richard Dormer, who played Vimes, he was my least favourite actor out of the main cast. He had 2 facial expressions. No, he had 3 facial expressions. One was eyes closed, one was eyes open, and one was one eye closed, one eye open. No other facial expressions the whole time. In many ways, he was Vimes, the drunken, disillusioned captain who's lost his way and is just getting on with the job in front of him. We had a few nods to some iconic Vimes moments, so the boots were mentioned, he had a cigar sometimes, but he lacked that innate goodness that Vimes has. And it's talked about in the script that he is inherently a good person and that under Vimes the watch will always be good and will succeed and... But we didn't see that, we didn't understand that, we were just told it by other characters, but we never actually saw it in action. He just goes along with what everyone else does. He doesn't care, he's just going along with it because Vetinari told him to. After the first episode, I sat there and I was like, do I believe that this is Vimes? And at the end of the day, I didn't believe that this character would give up nearly all of his salary to help widows and orphans, which is what Book Vimes does even when he's at his lowest point. Even when he's at rock bottom and he has nothing, he gives it away to help those who he thinks other people should be helping. The people who should be helped, he helps them. And I don't believe that this Vimes would do that. The last one of the main cast is Cheery, played by Joe Eaton Kent. As I mentioned earlier, I thought they did a really good job of kind of carrying the show. Their energy and on-screen presence really sort of took... they really carried the show on their backs. They and Lara Rossi were the MVPs of the watch. That's not to say there weren't questionable moments. I'm still recovering. I can't believe I have to say these words in a sentence together. From the summoning dark-powered Vogue routine. You heard me correctly. Cheery was a very interesting character here. I'm going to use they-them pronouns to discuss Cheery because I think by the end of the show that's what they were going by. But for the majority of the show, they did go by she-her pronouns as in the book. In many ways, I think TV Cheery was closest to book Cheery, you know, comparing the two. Partly because, unlike all the others, which as we've gone through, they were kind of diminished to their basic tropes, then the character of Cheery was actually used to explore ideas of gender and expression and self-love and things like that. So I did really appreciate that was kind of brought to the forefront and not eradicated. I know a lot of producers, and I think this is a fear that a lot of Terry Pratchett fans have, that a lot of producers would have looked at the character of Cheery and definitely done it wrong. They would have got it wrong somehow. So I'm really glad that the production team cast a non-binary actor to play Cheery and had a sort of storyline about Cheery's exploration of their own gender identity throughout the series. I thought that was really good. I don't know if it was always done in the best way. I think if you watched the show having never read Discworld, it would have come across really well. I think because they used a lot of Discworld things and basically took the names and applied them to other things. So I mentioned the Summoning Dark earlier. The Summoning Dark was basically a metaphor for your own internalised homophobia, transphobia, insert thing here, phobia, and being able to embrace that and celebrate it as part of who you are was sort of seen as a good thing, whereas we know that the summoning dark is a metaphor for depression, and it's Vimes who lives with that and embraces that and kind of lives with that darkness in his life. So hearing, I don't know, something just didn't sit right with me about queerness being described as the dark. I wasn't a huge fan of that. Another little complaint, and again, I do think Joe Eaton Kent was the right person for the job and that they cast really well for that one. The gag about Carrot being a 6-foot dwarf was kind of lost by Cheery not being a small dwarf. They do mention in the show that not all dwarves are short, but that did kind of lose the joke about Carrot being a 6-foot dwarf. But in the vast realm of things wrong with the show, that was just a teeny tiny complaint, so I can't complain too much. So those are the main 5 characters who were in the show, and there are some obvious glaring omissions. So first of all, Detritus, who did appear in 3 episodes and was killed off, spoiler, was killed off quite early on by an arrow. He's made of rock. He's a troll made of rock, and they killed him with an arrow. Now I admit I haven't shot an arrow at a rock recently, but I can't imagine it would leave much more than just a tiny teeny dent unless it was like limestone or something. So yeah, that was definitely questionable from a world building perspective. They did confirm later on that trolls are rocks, so that was kind of a bit rubbish, really. And there's no Nobby and no Colon. How can you make the Watch without Nobby and Colon? They're not my favourite characters. They're no one's favourite characters. They might be your favourite characters. But, like, I get it, okay? I get that they're not tropey hero type of people. But you can't make an adaptation of the Watch without Nobby and Colon. Where were they? Where were they? We know where they were. They weren't in it because they don't fit a tropey ragtag hero type. They don't have a trope. They just are. They're the comic relief, but they're also fab and we love them. Why miss out Nobby and Colon? Both killing off Detritus early on and getting rid of Nobby and Colon just proves to me that if you couldn't fit into a trope, they weren't interested in having the character on there. One of the greatest things about Terry Pratchett is how he's constantly subverting our expectations. In big ways sometimes, but sometimes in small ways, with just the tiny little things being changed. With characters not quite fitting the mould that you're used to them fitting. That's what makes Terry Pratchett so great. That everything is just that little bit unexpected and has a little bit of a Pratchett twist. And all of that was gone. The reason I wanted to discuss the characters in this video is because I think the characterisation of the characters and who they've omitted, I think that speaks to the whole show. That the approach for the whole show was to go, what fits people's expectations the most easily? Let's just do that and then slap some Terry Pratchett names on it. I mentioned at the start that I liked the way the guilds were set up, and I did. I liked the way they were set up. We only saw the Thieves Guild, the Assassins Guild, and the Musicians Guild. And it would have been great to see more of the guilds, to see the Beggars Guild or even the Seamstresses Guild. It would have been great to get that kind of, or the Alchemist Guild, the Fools Guild, to get that wider view that it's not just a city where crime is legalised, because that's what it became. It became all about the thieves and the assassins and how terrible they are, and all the characters think that it's terrible and it should all be stopped at no matter what cost. And one of the fun things about the Ankh-Morpork books is that everyone just kind of goes along with it. And it's only when the guilds break their own rules and their own code that it becomes a problem, and then it's interesting to see where is that line? What is the line the assassins draw? What is the line that the thieves draw? That's what's interesting, rather than have Sybil go off about how they're the worst thing to ever happen. it's fun that you have a fantasy sissy that's set up that way. It's entertaining and it's different. By the time the series was coming to a conclusion, I felt more like I was watching an original series with Discworld Easter eggs. They would reference something and I'd be like, oh, I understood that. I know that. Which shouldn't have surprised me because it's theoretically based on Discworld. But it unfortunately did. I do want to give a quick shout out though to the way that they did the auditors. I loved that. It was so good, so creative, and I mean I like the auditors in Hogfather. It fits with the tone of that film, you know, of that kind of very literal translation of the book. But I did really like the auditors in this. I thought they were done really well. And I liked that it was the one thing where I felt like as someone who read the books, I was more in the loop than someone who hadn't. You know, it felt like a nice Easter egg for us that we knew who they would eventually be and other people were kind of left to work that out. Whereas the rest of the show felt a bit more like, oh, you've read the books? Ha ha ha, we've got you watching now. Have a whole different thing. I don't know whether there's going to be another series of The Watch. Who knows? I don't know if I want another series. It was fine. Like I said, I had a not terrible time watching it. You know, I would sit down an evening and watch a couple of episodes and have fun. But it was not an adaptation of Terry Pratchett. My hope is that somewhere in, I don't know what the rights deal was like, I hope it wasn't exclusive and that someone else can do a better job of putting these characters on screen. I am very optimistic about The Amazing Morris that's coming up very soon. We've only had some stills so far, but I think it's going to be really, really good. So I'll definitely be watching that as soon as it comes out. I'm going to have to get Sky especially. But I'm really excited for that one. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have watched The Watch, then let me know what you thought. Do you think my theory stands up? What were your favourite parts about the show? If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, give it a comment, all of those things, and I will see you next time. Bye! On the actual show, it says, inspired by characters created. We should wait for the motorbike to leave. Dude. Especially because they did confirm later on that Trox are rocks. The Trox are rocks.